Okay, we did our report on poster on chapter 6, the New Republic from 1785 to 1815.
Alright, one of the first tests of the Republic was the Whiskey Rebellion. It was a series of disturbances against the enforcement of U.S. federal law imposing a tax on whiskey. The tax fell largely on western Pennsylvania, where most of the grain farmers were also distillers and a large amount of their income depended on the whiskey. The people were also angered by the lack of federal courts, the large number of absentee landlords, and the lack of protection from the Indians. They saw this new law as an attack on their liberty and economic well-being. The growing or organized resistance to the tax, even including the tarring and feathering of local revenue officials and the federal authorities issued warrants for the arrest of a large number of non-compliant distillers. Riots broke out and a federal officer was killed and a regional inspector's home was burned. Washington ordered a militia to proceed in the country where the disturbances took place. They were met with little resistance, and the troops seized a number of people, most of whom were released because of lack of evidence. 2 offenders were convicted of treason but later pardoned by Washington. This was a test of the federal government's prerogative and law enforcement power.
The election of 1796 set the pattern for future elections. It was the first real competitive election the United States had seen since before that time George Washington was voted unanimously into office. Running were Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the Republicans, and John Adams and Thomas Pinckney were the Federalists. The election was held in 1796, and one of the main problem with this election was that they took the two people that had the top electoral votes, and which happened to be Jefferson and Adams. And so Jefferson became vice president and Adams was president, while they each were from different parties.
The XYZ affair was a diplomatic incident involving a commissioner sent to France to negotiate outstanding differences between the countries. These differences arose because the U.S. refused to aid France in their war against Britain. A 3-man commission was immediately sent. The French government refused to see them officially. So the French foreign missioner informed them that he would not negotiate with them unless the U.S. government agreed to lend the French government $10 million and give the foreign minister a gift of $250,000. The commissioners rejected the proposal and forwarded it to President Adams and the Congress. When it was released in the U.S., it created quite an uproar, and Congress authorized the preparation for war. War was never declared, but the French and U.S. both attacked each other navally. Neither side wanted to go to war, and later the French government denounced their agents which had sent the request for money, and the result of their negotiations was the Treaty of Montefiore.
As of the election of 1800, they still hadn't worked out all the kinks in the election process. The problem at this time was that people voting didn't specify who they wanted as president and vice president. So in the election of 1800, Jefferson and Burr both received 73 electoral votes. So it was taken to Congress for Congress to decide who would be president and who would be vice president. Since Congress was dominated by Federalists, it took some time since Jefferson and Burr were both Republicans. Jefferson won the presidency, and soon after the 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution to prevent this incident from happening again.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by Congress under the threat of war with France. The first was a Neutralization Act. It required that all aliens reside for 14 years before being eligible for U.S. citizenship. The Alien Act, which authorized the president to deport any alien who he thought was dangerous to the peace and safety of the U.S. during peace times. And the third was the Alien Enemies Act, which allowed, during wartime, the arrest and imprisonment and deportation of any alien who was the subject of an enemy power. The last is the Sedition Act. It declared that any treasonable activities, including the publication of false, scandalous, or spiteful writings, was a crime and could be punishable by fine or imprisonment. 25 men were arrested, and this created a public outcry to the entire Alien and Sedition Acts. Many questioned the constitutionality of these acts, and public opposition to the acts was so great that it was in part responsible for the election of Jefferson to the presidency. Once Jefferson was in office, he pardoned all those convicted by the acts, and Congress restored all fines with interest.
In 1803, the United States purchased a parcel of land called the Louisiana Territory in a treaty called the Louisiana Purchase. France was on the verge of war with Britain, and since the United States had troops stationed on the border of the territory, France was afraid that they would invade the territory if France went to war with Britain, so they sold the Louisiana Territory for $15 million to the United States. Shortly after it became part of the United States, an expedition was set up headed by Lewis and Clark, who would spend time exploring a route from St. Louis to the Pacific. They left in May 1804 and ended their expedition in September 1806. Lewis and Clark walked from St. Louis to the Pacific and back. The information they gathered provided America with most of their knowledge of the continent at that time. Sacagawea was an Indian woman who helped them along their way to make the Indian encounters more friendly and to help them trade for horses and other supplies. On the return trip, Lewis and Clark split up to cover more territory. The trip covered a total of 7,700 miles.
Mulberry versus Madison. President John Adams, shortly before leaving office, appointed numerous Federalists to federal court positions in what is called the Midnight Appointments. Mulber was made Justice of the Peace during these controversial appointments. When Jefferson's administration took control, James Madison wouldn't deliver any of the commissions. Mulber sued Madison and took his course all the way to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Marshall was a known Federalist. Marshall took this as an opportunity to further define the Supreme Court's power. Marshall held that Mulber was entitled to a commission, but that the law that enabled the Supreme Court to enforce any federal office to perform a certain act was unconstitutional because it gave the Supreme Court authority which had been directly denied in the Constitution, Article 3. This was the first time the Supreme Court had declared an act passed by Congress unconstitutional. This decision established the doctrine of judicial review, which is crucial in our checks and balances system.
Finally, there was the War of 1812. It lasted from 1812 to 1815, which is a 3-year time period, and ended in a tie. The United States started the war by invading Canada and blocking British commerce with North America. The battle took place on land, mainly on the border of the United States and Canada and at sea. The United States, surprisingly enough, had many successes on sea, which made up for the losses that they had on land. For example, they tried unsuccessfully to invade Canada 3 times at the beginning of the war. In 1815, both sides got tired of war and decided to end, and they signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1815. News of the treaty didn't get back to the troops on the front in time, and the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the treaty had been signed, which later, ironically, became one of the most famous battles in the war.